Raila Odinga taking an informal oath to be the people's president.
The three largest broadcasters stayed off air.
Kenyans have no option but to stare at dark screens.
It's a serious threat to the freedom of the media at a delicate political situation.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the developments we're tracking this week. Kenya, the election story from last year that runs and runs, and the media now caught in the middle. Viewer beware. YouTube puts labels on news videos in the US produced by state-funded media outlets. It's back to the drawing board for the French president, whose media strategy was due for a change. And tone-deaf advertising at the Super Bowl. Kenya is in the midst of a political power struggle, and the country's media outlets are at the heart of the story. When opposition leader Raila Odinga held a mock inauguration ceremony last week, declaring himself the people's president, he was out to challenge the legitimacy of President Uhuru Kenyatta, who won an election held late last year that Odinga boycotted, saying the vote was rigged. The Kenyatta government wants to put the election story behind it, get on with governing, and deny Odinga the oxygen of publicity. So it ordered the Kenyan media to ignore the alternative inauguration. And when 3 privately owned TV channels defied those orders and tried to broadcast the event, the authorities pulled the plug on them. Journalists cried foul at the government's heavy-handed approach, but it's not like the Kenyan media don't have some credibility issues of their own. Our starting point this week is Nairobi. At some point, somebody in the Kenyatta government, presumably the president himself, would have made this calculation. What would be worse? A piece of political theater, televised, devised to put the legitimacy of the government in question? Or denying the media the right to broadcast the ersatz event?
Viewers countrywide were thrown into the dark.
The signal that sends, the perception it creates.
It might have seemed like a good idea in the short term as a show of force, but what it does in the long term is it says we are going to undermine the public's right to information for the sake of securing this short-term power. And that's a real threat to democracy. And I think if they hadn't given it as much attention as they did, it would have just been a footnote in the political history of the country.
The first thing is it tells us that the government itself does not feel that it is bound by the Constitution and by our laws. What's really significant here is that our media, from when the Kenyatta government came in, have pretty much behaved like this government can be their friend. They thought that would buy them some protection. And what they're now learning is that all they have done is to embolden the state.
Kenya's presidential election should have been settled 5 months ago, August 8, 2017. The incumbent, Uhuru Kenyatta, was declared the winner by 10 points over Raila Odinga. Odinga challenged the result in court, saying the Electoral Commission's computers had been hacked, the results tampered with. The Supreme Court ruled with Odinga, saying that by denying the court access to its IT system, the commission left the judges with no choice. They nullified the election results and ordered another vote for October. The second round played out like a farce. Odinga pulled out, saying the fix was in. A key member of the Electoral Commission fled the country, citing political interference and death threats. Voter turnout was less than half of what it was in round 1, and the Electoral Commission declared Kenyatta the winner with more than 98% of the vote.
In most civilized countries, when the Electoral Commission gives the result, that is the result, and everybody accepts it, and the country moves on. In Kenya, we have a very, very different society because there's been suspicion, there's always a question mark. What didn't they tell us? Did they hide something? And I think the media finds itself in that space.
Most notably, after the election of late 2007. The results were disputed, and the violence lasted for months. More than 1,000 were killed, more than 500,000 displaced, refugees of an electoral aftermath. The causes of that violence were many and complex. However, the Kenyan media got much of the blame. During the campaign, television stations had aired incendiary political ads in breach of their own regulations. Small local radio stations then incited the post-election violence by broadcasting hate speech. Stung by that criticism, many Kenyan news outlets changed their ways, toned down their content, and started playing it safe.
It's absolutely untrue that we are the ones who caused this problem. Post-election violence had a whole set of other causal issues. But that, to me, is the moment in which the media started to take a step back from directly criticizing the state, the politicians, and giving up this space. I call it the "we want peace" narrative.
So between 2007 and 2013, the media was in this space where they were thinking, okay, how do we do the next general election without being blamed? And so the media was then criticized in 2013, and I think rightly so, for having been too careful.
That vote in 2013 was the first to elect President Kenyatta. By year's end, his government had passed a new media law, giving itself the power to fine news outlets, a law those outlets opposed and one the US-based Committee to Protect Journalists described as draconian. The Kenyan media might have seen that law coming. Earlier that year, on the 100th day of his presidency, Kenyatta summoned media owners and their executives to a breakfast meeting.
The government will allow journalists from media houses be embedded to State House, apart from opening the government to scrutiny by the media.
As one of the president's allies in the media puts it, Kenyatta simply spelled out the role he expected journalists to play.
So what the president was asking on that occasion is that we should not be adversarial, even as you are the public watchdog, even as you set the agenda. The agenda should not be adversarial, meaning the media should not make itself as an opposition party. It should play the role of being for the state. That is the message that the president was trying to get out, because the media in Kenya has always played the role of an opposition party.
President Uhuru Kenyatta earlier today sought to write a new chapter in government relations with the media.
So it's fine, he can call them in, they can have tea, he can articulate what his agenda is, but then the media has to be able to take a step back and critique what the president is saying, and that never happened. At the time that the media was called in, the government was engaged in what it called an anti-terror operation in Garissa, which is to the northeast, where it had rounded up upwards of 500 people. It was just picking up people off the street. They were suspected terrorists, Not a single person in the media took the opportunity during that breakfast to ask about that operation.
From this media breakfast with the state, what they did was they escalated the "we want peace" narrative. It's like, well, you're the media, you're not a PR agency. You're the media. Your job is to keep their feet in the fire, to keep them honest. That's the whole concept of a fourth estate, that keeps people honest. And when they decide to go in bed with the executive and become an extension of the executive, if you think about it as a table, it's a table with 3 legs. How is it supposed to stand?
This story comes down to questions of legitimacy. The Kenyatta government had its legitimacy challenged by Raila Odinga in the most public of ways. The media tried to broadcast that ceremony, perhaps hoping to regain the legitimacy they squandered last year, falling short as election watchdogs and going soft on the Kenyatta government. If the Kenyan media thought that would land them in the government's good graces, then what happened last week proved they made a big mistake. And going to black the way they did will have come as a rude awakening.
It hasn't been seen in this country where all the major television stations are shut down because of a story, not that they covered, but that they were going to cover. This is one of the most vibrant media spaces on the continent, and I really do hope that this was a bad dream. It's going to go away. We are going to wake up to the usual vibrant media, professional media that we've known Kenya to have.
The shutdown was just some sort of wake-up call. Even them, this is an opportunity that they should be grateful for forever. They have got a wake-up call.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar today with one of our producers, Tariq Nafa. Tariq, YouTube has just introduced a new feature that will alert users when they're watching news content that is funded by governments. What's the point of this?
Yeah, this is the latest in a series of measures by social media companies to try and counter misinformation and propaganda online, but it's already proven contentious. YouTube says it took the decision to help users better understand the sources of news content. They posted this screenshot from Radio Free Asia, which is funded by the US Congress, as an example. Here's the problem, though. YouTube will not differentiate between news outlets that are publicly funded but editorially independent and outlets that take funding and editorial direction from a government. US public broadcaster PBS isn't happy about that. It says it gets a small amount of its funding from the US government, the rest from private donations, and it doesn't want to be labelled a state broadcaster, which it could be under the new rules.
So who's going to be seeing these labels? Which news outlets stand to be affected?
So at the moment, it's only YouTube videos that are being played in the US, but plenty of global outlets are likely to be affected, including the UK's BBC, China's CGTN, and this one, Al Jazeera, which is funded by the Qatari government. But I think it's fair to say that this move primarily targets outlets like the Russian-funded RT. There's been a bit of hysteria in the US over Russian attempts to influence the 2016 election, and RT has been singled out on that. So I asked RT for its reaction to this move, and they said, congratulations to YouTube on labelling our content with the basic info we've always made known. Peculiar, though, that in its hierarchy of broadcasters, some are more government-funded than others.
The other story you've been looking into is the intensification of the crackdown against certain news websites in Egypt. What's the story there?
Yeah, it's worth starting at the beginning with this story. In May last year, the government began blocking access to dozens of news websites, among them one of the few independent media outlets left in Egypt, Madamasa. According to a Cairo-based NGO, the blacklist has grown to some 496 different platforms, and that includes news outlets, human rights organizations, blogs, and VPNs. Some blocked media outlets, like Madamasa, for example, had been using a Google publishing tool called AMP, Accelerated Mobile Pages, which allows Egyptians to see Madamasa's content on their mobiles. The New York Times and CNN use AMP as well, but now that's been blocked too.
What reasoning, what justification is the government offering for this, if any?
Well, that's the interesting thing. There's been no comment from the government, not now, nor back in May when this crackdown first began. It's worth mentioning, though, that Egypt is gearing up for an election next month, and the current president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has pretty much snuffed out all his competition.
Okay, thanks, Tarek. During last year's presidential election campaign, Emmanuel Macron was the darling of the French news media. His promises of a new world and a new French revolution seemed tailor-made for the times. So did Macron's image as the politician offering a cure for France's stagnant economy. He swept to power 66% of the vote, demolishing his opponent from the far right. However, his romance with the media has since turned sour. The new president's reluctance to engage with journalists has made him appear aloof, distant, and has made some contentious policies, such as spending cuts and an overhaul of labor laws, that much harder to sell. So Macron's been changing his approach, making himself more available. The Listening Post's Cristina Martinez now from Paris on how Emmanuel Macron's revamped media strategy is going down with France's troublesome and opinionated fourth estate.
It's a classic political tactic. Court the news media on your way to power. Make time for them. Smile for the cameras. Then, once you're sworn into office, develop a sudden aversion to journalists.
J'ai pris la décision de ne pas avoir une présidence bavarde.
On a rarement l'occasion de le voir, Emmanuel Macron.
We very rarely see Macron. The Élysée Palace is quite an impregnable fortress. Macron does not host luncheons with journalists like his predecessor, François Hollande, used to. He stopped doing all of that. There's never an off-the-record moment. He's a president who is always on the record.
Macron arrived at the Élysée Palace having been traumatized by what had happened to his predecessor at the hands of the media. As Minister for Finance, Macron witnessed that from up close and must have thought, not me. His solution was to build a Berlin Wall, so to speak, between him and journalists.
The first brick in that wall was Macron's mobile phone. François Hollande made his mobile number available to journalists. Dozens of them could contact the former president anytime. Macron didn't want to play the game that way. And from his earliest days in office, he made it clear which journalists he wanted covering his story. At the outset, Emmanuel Macron seemed like he was part president, part assignment editor.
For instance, only a few days into his mandate, the president decided to travel to Mali. He then contacted certain media outlets to let them know he only wanted journalists who specialized in defense and foreign policy, not political journalists. This caused quite a stir among media outlets who rightly said that the president should not be allowed to choose which journalists to have by his side. It was his first show of strength.
A
lot of journalists think he almost never talks, but that's not true. He talks with quite a lot of journalists, but they're mainly foreign, and that annoys French journalists a lot. He talked to CNN.
Mr. President, welcome to the program.
And when he went to Africa, he spoke to 200 students.
Je suis d'une génération de Français pour qui les crimes de la colonisation européenne sont incontestables et font partie de notre histoire.
So it's not that he doesn't speak, it's just that he talks to others. The media here have no choice but to use bits of these encounters.
Emmanuel Macron promet une relation nouvelle entre l'Europe et l'Afrique.
Macron's choice of words is never a coincidence. He often uses English terms.
Celui qui nous permettra de make our planet great again.
Créer une task force anti-Daesh.
Pardon de cet anglicisme, mais les fake news.
And it's very disrupting for us as French journalists and also for French people who feel disconnected. We are not the target of his messages. He is targeting business executives and decision makers worldwide.
Within 3 months of taking office, having won 66% of the vote, Macron saw a sharp slide in his poll numbers. His proposed labour reforms and tax cuts were making the wrong kinds of headlines. So Macron did what most politicians who are having trouble with journalists do. He hired one. Bruno Roger Petit, a business journalist, was his new communications director.
L'une des premières grandes interviews qu'Emmanuel Macron accorde, c'est au magazine Challenge, et c'est Bruno Roger Petit qui en est l'un des auteurs, avec 2 autres confrères.
Roger Petit made room in Macron's schedule for magazines like the glossy Paris Match and the conservative Le Point. On the TV side, he paired his boss with Cyril Hanouna, a celebrity host who is more of an actor-comedian than a journalist.
Macron favours media outlets that have a direct impact on the public, like Paris Match, which likes covering the presidential couple, or Cyril Hanouna, who is extremely popular with young people.
Oui, bonsoir, Président.
Oui.
Comment ça va, Président?
Ça va très bien.
Pour les journalistes politiques.
Of course, when Macron calls Cyril Hanouna live on TV, the political journalists are choking because they keep trying to reach the president and in fact are still waiting for a call back.
Toujours attendre que le président les rappelle.
Écoutez, Jupiter est descendu de son nuage. Il veut pas rencontrer les journalistes, mais il décroche quand Cyril Hanouna l'appelle.
It was almost 5 months before Macron relented and granted his first French TV interview. He didn't go to France's state broadcaster. He chose the largest privately owned channel TF1 instead.
Est-ce que votre lien avec les Français ne s'est pas distendu depuis 5 mois et est-ce que ça n'explique pas, entre autres, votre décision de nous parler ce soir?
When he finally did speak to state TV, Macron and the journalist Laurent Delahousse strolled around the Élysée Palace. It struck French journalists and audiences as a very American style of light-touch interviewing.
L'atout de jeunesse de Macron est quand même...
Macron's youth has been a major asset in his political rise. He realised he couldn't present himself in the same way as former presidents. He needed to do something in keeping with his New World ideal. So he invited someone from his generation. They met as 2 young people, one a president, the other a journalist, with the most important audience in France. He decided to act like they do on American shows.
I think Macron tricked Laurent Delahousse. How do you conduct a meaningful interview when you're strolling through the Élysées corridors in dim light? You can't ask sharp questions in that kind of setting.
On est dans votre bureau ou dans l'un de vos bureaux. Il y a quelques minutes, on m'a dit que c'était pas toujours le même bureau. Vous avez plusieurs bureaux à l'Élysée.
Donc, en acceptant cette forme,
By accepting this format, Delahousse was forced to go in with a series of softball questions. It looked like a concession from the press, and it added fuel to the fire regarding the media's relationship with the president.
Quand on fait du journalisme, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? On pose des questions précises. Sinon, c'est pas la peine. Ah bah oui, sinon, on fait la une d'un journal papier glacé, et puis voilà.
Emmanuel Macron no longer gives French journalists the silent treatment, but the relationship is far from cordial.
Les journalistes ont un problème. Ils s'intéressent trop à eux-mêmes et pas assez au pays.
He has criticized previous presidents for being too close to journalists, accused the French media of narcissism, and has reportedly called the state broadcaster la honte de la République, the shame of the Republic.
Macron has made it clear they're in for an overhaul. Among the buzzwords being circulated, there is restructuring and externalization. That means putting more TV production work into the hands of independent media companies. But there's also talk of big budget cuts. Media analysts here say the proposed reforms could result in less public service journalism and eventually fewer people holding power to account.
For instance, the government plans to change the amount of airtime parliamentary parties get on TV. This could mean about 70% of airtime goes to Macron's own party, En Marche, and only 30% of airtime goes to all the others. This could be a game changer. But for now, we know very little about these reforms, so we shouldn't prejudge the president.
The whole history of French presidents and broadcasters, whether with Mitterrand, Chirac, Sarkozy, a bit less with Hollande, has been about keeping public TV and radio under their control. I think he's really old world, in that he thinks he should have complete control over public broadcasting.
When it comes to the media, Macron's intentions are not all that different to his predecessors, even if the tactics and the rhetoric are. If the French president gets away with it, his so-called revolution will be televised his way.
Finally, the media extravaganza that is the Super Bowl, American football's annual finale, is a showcase for advertisers. They pay up to $5 million for a 30-second spot. Ram trucks ponied up this year and used an unlikely pitchman, Martin Luther King, through extracts from one of his speeches back in 1968. The company somehow failed to foresee that the appropriation of the words of an African-American civil rights leader to sell cars would not go down well. And it's the NFL, where hundreds of players have been taking a knee to protest the treatment of African-Americans at the hands of the police. In short, the optics were brutal. Here's some of the ad in question, alongside another version, a subvertisement by Current Affairs magazine, which uses different extracts of the same speech to make a rather different point about the shamelessness of the advertising industry. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
If you want to be important, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. We are so often taken by advertisers, you know, those gentlemen of massive verbal persuasion. And they have a way of saying things to you that kind of gets you in the bind. In order to make your neighbors envious, you must drive this type of car. In order to be lovely to love, you must wear this kind of lipstick or this kind of perfume. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know the theory of relativity to serve. You only need a heart full of grace. I've got to drive this car because it's something about this car that makes my car a little better than my neighbor's car. And I am sad to say that the nation in which we live is the supreme culprit. And I'm going to continue to say it to America.